Hello and welcome to the Biology 6 lecture on the immune system, Part 1. If you look in the lecture handout, it defines the immune system. Well, I should say that the immune system is also known as the body defenses, but we generally refer to it as the immune system. Anyway, in the lecture handout, it defines the immune system as the parts of the body that guard against pathogens. And what are pathogens? Well, they are disease-causing organisms. So any living thing that can cause a disease is a pathogen. And there are several types of pathogens, but the two most abundant types, the two types of pathogens that cause the most diseases, are bacteria and viruses.
So I want to take just a few minutes briefly talking about what a bacteria is and what a virus is. Well, this is a microscopic photograph of some bacteria. Each of these little bluish oval shapes, like here and here and here and here, each of those is one bacteria. So bacteria are microscopic organisms. Each bacteria is unicellular, meaning its whole body is just one cell. So they are single-celled or tiny single-celled organisms. And incidentally, each bacterial cell is a lot smaller than your own cells. Typical bacteria is between 10 to 100 times smaller than one of your own body cells. But that being said, they are living cells, so they take in calories or glucose like our cells do for energy, and just like our cells do, they reproduce themselves by dividing. Okay, so those are what bacteria are, tiny little single-celled organisms. Viruses are, this just shows how tiny the bacteria are. I thought this was kind of interesting looking. Believe it or not, this big thing they're showing here is the tip of a needle, greatly magnified. When you look at a needle with the naked eye, it looks very smooth and looks like it comes to a sharp point. But if you magnify a needle, you can actually see it has little grooves in the metal, and the point isn't perfectly sharp. It actually is slightly flat at the end. But if you look very, very closely at it, like here, you can see these tiny little orange spots on there. Each of those is a bacteria. And I like this picture because it emphasizes how small bacteria are. It looks like thousands and thousands of them could easily fit at the very point of a needle. Kind of amazing. Well, as small as bacteria are, viruses are even smaller. If this is a bacteria cell, here's a virus cell. Viruses are even tiny compared to bacteria. And viruses are very interesting organisms. They're in sort of a fuzzy zone between being living and non-living. Some biologists consider viruses to be living organisms, and others do not. But whether or not we consider them to be alive, they certainly cause diseases. And here's how they cause diseases. Viruses have no way of reproducing themselves. Like a virus by itself can't divide to make more viruses. Viruses only get reproduced by getting inside our cells, and they essentially trick our cells into reproducing the virus. Or saying the same thing a slightly different way, a virus gets inside your cells and it reprograms that cell to become a virus factory. And so here's a cartoon of that, or not a cartoon, but an animation. These are some of the cells inside the human body. So think of these as your cells. If a virus infects your body, then that virus will get inside one of your cells, like this. And once it gets inside, it takes control of the cell, and it turns that cell into a virus factory. And so the cell starts making copies of that virus, like you see here. And eventually, that cell gets so filled with viruses that it bursts. And so, that cell gets killed off. And then as those viruses burst out, they spread into neighboring cells in your body. And then the process repeats itself. Now, each of those viruses will reprogram those cells into becoming virus factories. And so those cells will now burst and release those viruses, which will spread to other cells. Okay, yeah, so viruses have to get inside our cells to reproduce, whereas bacteria don't have to do that. Bacteria can just live inside your body and cause disease just by being inside your body at all. Now, so when I say that the immune system, or the body defenses as we sometimes call it, but when I say the immune system guards against pathogens, I mean two things by that. The immune system tries to stop pathogens from ever entering your body, so it tries to be a barrier to stop those pathogens from even getting inside you. But when they do get inside you, it tries to kill them off. It tries to battle them once they've gotten inside you. And the term for that is an infection. When we say a person has an infection, it means their body has been invaded by pathogens. And like I said, when we talk about pathogens, what we're normally talking about are bacteria and viruses. Okay, well, these pathogens are everywhere around us. The air has bacteria and sometimes viruses just floating around in it naturally. Every surface that you touch has some pathogens on it. Every bit of food that you eat, no matter how well you cook the food, will have some pathogens on it. And so what I'm saying is your body is always being exposed to pathogens. And you're constantly breathing in air and taking in food and water. And so you're always getting at least some level of infection as those pathogens are coming into you. But your immune system is good enough so that most of the time you don't even feel sick because your immune system can fight off those pathogens effectively. But sometimes, at least temporarily, the pathogens do get an upper hand. And so sometimes, at least for a week or two, or maybe longer, you'll be fighting, your body will be actively fighting a big infection. Now, incidentally, although we think of your immune system as mostly there to fight pathogens, your immune system also defends against certain types of cancer. Now, cancer is when your own body cells start reproducing in a dangerous and out of control manner. And so your immune system also fights cancers within your body. Now, obviously, it's not 100% effective at doing that because people do get cancer and can even die of cancer. But the point is, we would have a lot more cancers in our body if it weren't for the immune system constantly battling them. And just to give an example of that, if a person loses their immune system, how could that happen? Well, there's this disease called AIDS, and people who have AIDS lose their immune system. And people who lose their immune system, like people with AIDS, they start getting a whole bunch of cancers in their body that would not be growing if not for their immune system. So the point is that a healthy immune system, one of the things it does is fight a lot of cancers for us that we would get if not for the immune system fighting them back. So let's imagine that a person has become infected by some sort of pathogen, and so let's not worry whether it's a bacteria or a virus or some other type of pathogen. But let's just say that the person's body has been infected, so the pathogens have gotten inside the person. The immune system has to be able to figure out which cells in the body are the body's own cells and which cells are the pathogen cells. And at first you say, well, that it's going to be easy because these just look very different from the body cells. Yeah, but the thing is that your immune system doesn't have little eyeballs. And so your immune system cannot visually just look at cells inside and figure out whether they are viruses or bacteria. So how does your immune system distinguish between the pathogens that have infected the body versus the normal body cells? And the answer is things called antigens. So we define antigens here as molecules that the immune system interacts with. But usually when we say antigens, what we mean is proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids that fats are the same as lipids. So proteins, carbohydrates, and fats on the surface of a cell. So here's what this is about. All cells, whether it's your own cells or a bacteria cell or a virus, all cells have these molecules on their surface. That's just part of the natural structure of cells, that they have surface molecules. Yeah, so things like proteins and carbohydrates and lipids on the surface of the cell. are the cell's antigens. And your immune system has essentially feels the antigens on every cell that it finds inside your body. And so it's more by feeling the shapes of the antigens that your immune system figures out whether a cell inside you is your own cell or whether a cell inside you is one of these pathogen cells. So that's the basic idea. Your immune system interacts with the antigens of the cells in your body to figure out whether it's your own cell or whether it's a pathogen cell. Now let me kind of elaborate on that concept. So these pink-looking things are supposed to be cells of your own body, you know, like your own epithelial cells or muscle cells or connective tissue cells or nerve cells or whatever. So those are your own cells I'm showing in pink there. And so, yeah, your own cells have your own antigens on them, you know, your own proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. And we call the term for those are your self-antigens. That means the antigens that occur naturally as part of your body. And the cells of your immune system, which are your white blood cells, by the way, the cells of your immune system have essentially memorized the shapes of your own antigens. And so your immune system cells, as they're patrolling around inside your body, essentially feel the antigens of every cell they run into, and it says, okay, that's a self-antigen, I recognize that. Oh, that's a self-antigen, I recognize that also. That's a self-antigen, I recognize that also. Yeah, so they feel the antigens of every cell they run into, and since they've memorized your self-antigens, they know not to attack those cells because those are your own cells. But now let's imagine you've got an infection, so here comes a pathogen. Well, the pathogen has different antigens than your self-antigens, right? Because those are, let's say, bacterial antigens or viral antigens. Those are not the same as your own. And the term for those are foreign antigens. Foreign antigens are the antigens that do not occur naturally as part of your body. So these would be like the antigens on bacteria and viruses and other pathogens. Those are foreign antigens in your body. Well, when this white blood cell, this immune system cell, eventually runs into that pathogen cell like that, it's going to say, whoa, 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 wait, stop the presses. That's not a self-antigen I'm feeling. And so that's how the immune system cells figure out that this is a pathogen because it has foreign antigens on it, not self-antigens. And so your immune system attacks any cells that have foreign antigens on them. And you know, immune system cells have ways of signaling each other, hey, we've got a pathogen here, come in here and attack it. And so they all basically cluster around the cell that has the foreign antigens on it, and they have ways of killing it off. And so that's essentially how your immune system works. Its programming is pretty simple. If it feels the antigens on every cell it runs into, if there are self-antigens, it leaves that cell alone. If the antigens it feels are foreign antigens, it kills the cell. Does that sound okay so far? Okay, so that's the way the immune system works under normal, healthy circumstances. You know, don't attack cells that have self-antigens because those are your own cells, but do attack cells that have foreign antigens because those are the pathogen cells. That's the way it's supposed to work. Occasionally, very rarely, a person will have a type of disease called an autoimmune disease. And in an autoimmune disease, the immune system has gotten confused and it thinks one of your self-antigens is a foreign antigen. And so the immune system will start attacking tissues, your own cells, that have that particular self-antigen. And they don't know why this occurs. You know, why would the immune system get confused and think one of your self-antigens is a foreign antigen? Nobody knows, but it does happen sometimes. And just to give an example, there's a autoimmune disease called multiple sclerosis. And what's going on here is the immune system, for some mistaken reason, has decided that myelin molecule is a foreign antigen, so it needs to attack myelin. What's myelin? It's on your neuron. It's on your nerve cells. So remember back to the nervous system that the axons of neurons get coated with a white fatty material called myelin. So that's a self-antigen, right? Because your nerve cells make it naturally. But in people with multiple sclerosis, immune system, for some reason, thinks that myelin's a foreign antigen, so it starts killing off the myelin. So the person's with multiple sclerosis, their nerve cells lose the myelin, and the nerve cells can't do their signaling correctly without that myelin, and so the person starts losing the ability of the proper functioning of their nervous system. And of course, one of the proper functions of your nervous system is to send motor signals to your muscles. And so people with multiple sclerosis, as the autoimmune disease progresses, start losing the ability to control their muscles in a coordinated way. And I don't have a picture of it here, but another autoimmune disease is called rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system mistakenly thinks that hyaline cartilage is a foreign antigen. Hyaline cartilage is the cartilage in your joints. And so as the immune system starts attacking the cartilage in your joints, movements of your joints, like moving your fingers, starts to become painful because they've lost their cartilage. And so that's what rheumatoid arthritis is. It's an autoimmune disease too. Here's something also interesting about self-antigens and foreign antigens. So we get vaccinations. Lately we've all gotten vaccinations against the COVID virus, but we also get vaccinations against the flu virus every year. We can get vaccinations against tetanus and measles and mumps and things. When you get a vaccination, they're putting some of the foreign antigens inside you of the disease that they're protecting you against. So oftentimes what these vaccinations are is they just isolate just the antigens, not the actual bacteria or viruses, and they inject those antigens into you. So that's not going to cause the disease, right? Because they're not giving you the actual pathogens. They're just giving you the antigens. But if your immune system gets exposed to those antigens, it essentially primes your immune system to fight the real pathogen. And so by getting a COVID vaccination and by getting those COVID antigens, your immune system essentially learns how to fight the actual COVID virus. So if you do get exposed to the actual COVID virus, your immune system already knows how to fight it, and so in theory you don't get sick to it. And the same as the flu. When they inject you with the flu vaccination, they're giving you some of the antigens to the flu virus, so your immune system learns how to fight it. Okay, well, so now let's talk a little bit more about the actual parts of the immune system. The major cells of your immune system, your major immune cells are your white blood cells. White blood cells are sometimes called WBCs for short, white blood cell, or leukocytes is another term for white blood cells. So we studied the blood in its own chapter a week or two ago, and you might recall there are three major types of blood cells. There are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The red blood cells, their job is to carry oxygen. The platelets, their job is to do blood clotting, basically to stop you from bleeding if you've cut yourself. But the white blood cells are part of your immune system. Their job is to fight pathogens that have infected the body. When we did that chapter on the blood, I think I told you that there's actually subcategories of white blood cells. There are 5 major subcategories of white blood cells. But when we did that chapter, I said we're not going to learn the names of the 5 types of white blood cells yet, but that we would learn them when we talk about the immune system. Well, we've reached that day. And so starting now, I do want you to know the names of these 5 major types of white blood cells. And so here they are. They're called neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. And here's a picture of them. So yeah, I do want you to memorize the names of these. These are the 5 types of white blood cells. And each of these 5 types of white blood cells has its own particular role in your immune system. In other words, each of the 5 types fights the pathogens in its own particular way. But here on this chart that I made in your notes, I listed the function. In other words, I listed how each one of these 5 types fights pathogens for you. Notice that for 3 of these 5 types, the way they fight the pathogens is something called phagocytosis. So for neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes, their method of protecting you is this phagocytosis. But what is phagocytosis? Well, it essentially means one cell eating another cell. It's one cell engulfing another cell, but engulfing basically means swallowing, eating. And so here's a cartoon of that. Here's one of these white blood cells that does phagocytosis, like a neutrophil or a monocyte or an eosinophil. And when one of these white blood cells that does phagocytosis, when it finds a pathogen inside your body, it just eats it, basically. That's how it protects you from the pathogens. So just like when we eat food, we put that food inside ourselves, which is what this white blood cell has done, and then we digest that food, and so that's what these white blood cells that do phagocytosis do. They swallow the pathogen, then they digest it. They kill it off by digesting it. Okay, so again, who does that? The neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the monocytes. Now, that being said, there's kind of a nuance or a subtlety here with the monocytes. So on this table here in your notes, I listed monocytes do phagocytosis, and that's kind of true, but it's kind of not true. The monocytes themselves do not do any phagocytosis, but they turn into a slightly different cell type called a macrophage, and then the macrophage does the phagocytosis. So it's sort of like how Superman, he spends part of his time being Clark Kent, right? That's his secret identity. And when he's Clark Kent, he doesn't actually fight any of the villains. But when he has to fight villains, he turns himself into Superman, and then Superman goes out and fights the villains. Well, the macrophage is the Superman, and monocyte is Clark Kent. And so, those monocytes that you see here, they don't do any phagocytosis, but they turn into a macrophage, which is that thing, and then the macrophage goes off and does the phagocytosis. Okay, so again, neutrophils, eosinophils, and the monocytes after they become the macrophage are the white blood cells that do phagocytosis. And of those ones that I listed, the neutrophils and the macrophages are the 2 that do the most phagocytosis in your body. The other ones, the eosinophils, they do some phagocytosis, but not as much as the neutrophils and the macrophages. Okay, so summarizing this, that you have 5 types of white blood cells, and your white blood cells are the major cells of your immune system. They battle pathogens for you. So what I want to talk about next is where in your body do these white blood cells fight the pathogens? And at first you may say, well, you kind of told us that already. You told us the white blood cells are blood cells, so isn't it really in the blood where these cells fight the pathogens? And that's true. Your blood is one of the major battlefields where your white blood cells fight pathogens. That's true. But there's another area of your body called your lymphatic system, which is also a major battlefield between your white blood cells and pathogens. So I want to spend a few minutes describing exactly what your lymphatic system is. Where is that inside your body? And then we'll talk about exactly how your white blood cells battle the pathogens there inside your lymphatic system. Okay, so what and where exactly is your lymphatic system? All right, so when we were talking about blood vessels earlier in the semester, you learned that there are 3 major types of blood vessels: arteries, veins, and capillaries. And you remember that the arteries are the vessels that carry blood away from the heart towards an organ, and the veins are the blood vessels that carry blood out of that organ back towards the heart, and the capillaries are those tiny blood vessels inside the organs. And so here's kind of a diagram of that. Here's a tiny little vein bringing, this is supposed to be an organ, and these are the cells of the organ, the little dots. And so, here's an artery that's bringing blood into this organ. And remember that the tiny arteries that actually carry the blood into an organ are called arterioles. And here's a tiny vein carrying blood out of the organ, and we call this tiny veins venules. And these little lines inside the organ are the capillaries, these tiniest blood vessels. Okay, so there you see some blood flowing into the organ in that arteriole, and then that blood flows through these capillaries and eventually exits in that venule over there. Well, here's the thing. As the blood is flowing through the capillaries inside each organ, small amounts of watery liquid leak out of the, I went too far. Small amounts of watery liquid leak out of the capillaries and go amongst the cells in that organ. And we call that watery liquid that leaks out of the capillaries, we call that the tissue fluid. And it just becomes a watery liquid that surrounds and bathes all the cells in the tissues of each organ. And that's actually a good thing. Your tissues are supposed to have, the cells of your tissues are supposed to have some of this tissue fluid that surrounds them. That's just part of the normal substances that tissues are made out of. Okay, so again, the tissue fluid comes from water and other small molecules that, pardon me, thank you. My immune system's obviously working today. So the tissue fluid, this watery liquid that surrounds the cells in the tissues of your organs, that comes from water and other small molecules that leak out of the capillaries inside those organs. And so that's a good normal thing, a little bit of that leaking out of the fluids. But here's the thing. More liquid comes out of your capillaries than your tissues need. In other words, more tissue fluid is formed in this way every day than your tissues actually need. And so your tissues need a way to drain off that extra tissue fluid every day and put it back in your circulatory system. If they didn't, what would happen? Well, then your tissues would start getting more and more tissue fluid, and so they would just swell up to a larger and larger size. And that's called edema, where a tissue or an organ gets swollen. Yeah, so you would just get edema in all your tissues and organs if there wasn't some way to drain that extra tissue fluid back into your circulatory system. Well, there's a term for that excess tissue fluid that has to be drained away. We call it the lymph. Here it is. The lymph is the excess tissue fluid. And your lymphatic system is basically a group of vessels and tubes and ducts, little tube-like structures that drain the lymph, that drain the excess tissue fluid back into your circulatory system. And for some reason, textbooks always show these lymphatic vessels, these lymphatic tubes, green colored. I don't think they're green colored in real life, but for some reason they always show them that way. Yeah, so here's a lymphatic duct, lymphatic vessel, and its job is to drain the lymph, the excess tissue fluid, out of the tissues of this particular organ. But the thing is, all organs and all the tissues in your body have these lymphatic vessels to drain their excess tissue fluid. And so here's a kind of a diagram of the lymphatic system. Notice all throughout the guy's body, you see those little networks of lymphatic ducts. And so those are draining lymph from all the tissues of all the organs all throughout his body. Anyway, so these lymphatic ducts or vessels or tubes are just found throughout the body, and their job is to drain the lymph from all the tissues. Now, just like in the environment around us, little creeks drain water from a particular neighborhood or whatever, and then those creeks merge to form streams, and then several streams merge together to form rivers, and several rivers can merge together to form a mighty river that eventually carries all that water back into the ocean. Well, it's the same with all these lymphatic ducts. As they are carrying the lymph, they start merging with each other into larger and larger lymphatic ducts, and eventually they all converge into two places up here in these subclavian veins. If we zoom in there, all the lymphatic ducts throughout your entire body either converge here and drain the lymph back into your right subclavian vein, or over to here, where they drain the lymph back into your left subclavian vein. And I don't know why the body has chosen those two particular veins to be where all the lymph drains back into, but it does. They all eventually go back into the right subclavian vein or left subclavian vein, all the lymph throughout your body. Okay, so that's one major part of your lymphatic system, is all these ducts for draining the lymph back into your bloodstream. But in addition to that, if you look closely, there's some things they show like little kidney bean-shaped things all throughout your lymphatic system. Those are called lymph nodes, and they're basically kind of bean-shaped structures where several lymphatic vessels merge together. So here's a close-up of one. So this entire green-shaped thing right here is one lymph node, and you can see several lymphatic vessels are converging or merging into it right there, and then just one or two flow out of it. So they're basically convergence points of the lymphatic ducts are what these lymph nodes are. Hollow structures located at the points where the lymphatic vessels converge. And the lymph nodes filter the lymph to remove any impurities in it. But they also, what you also find in these lymph nodes are white blood cells. And do I have a picture there? So those are supposed to be some white blood cells. Yeah, so white blood cells. So your body stations white blood cells inside your lymph nodes. And that sort of makes sense, because if you have an infection, then some of those white blood cells might get into your tissue fluids, right? I'm sorry, some of those pathogen cells might get into your tissue fluids. And so they're going to be, those pathogens are going to be swept down into the lymph as the lymph gets sucked out of those tissues. And so those pathogens are going to come streaming down through your lymph vessels. And so that's why your body stations white blood cells inside your lymph nodes to pounce on those pathogens as they're being drained through by your lymphatic system. And so that's what I tried to capture here. So your lymphatic system is a network of vessels, ducts, and nodes throughout your body, and its main function is to return the lymph back into the circulatory system, but it also filters the lymph. I should have said it also has white blood cells stationed there as it's filtering to kill off the pathogens that are inside the lymph. Good, yeah. So if you have an infection, as the pathogens come in here and arrive at this lymph node, the white blood cells will attack them. Now, as those white blood cells are attacking the pathogens, the white blood cells will often multiply. They'll reproduce so they can fight the pathogens better, and that causes swelling of the lymph nodes. And so you might know that if a person goes to the doctor and the doctor thinks the person's fighting an infection, the doctor will sometimes feel the person's lymph nodes, and if the lymph nodes are swollen, that shows that the person's having an infection. The white blood cells inside the lymph nodes are swelling from the white blood cells reproducing. And there's something else sort of related to this with lymph nodes. So if a person gets cancer, let me go back here. So remember that cancer is where the body's own cells start reproducing in an out-of-control manner. Likewise, the cancer cells can get swept up in the lymph, and the cancer cells can end up getting stuck here in the lymph nodes. And that provides a way for doctors to see if a cancer is spreading in the body. Let me show you here. So this person, I think, has melanoma, which is a type of skin cancer. And so the doctors are trying to see whether it has spread. Metastasis means when a cancer is spreading. And so to see if the cancer is metastasized, the doctors are going to biopsy this nearby lymph node because if the cancer has spread, they're going to find some of the cancer cells that got stuck in this lymph node. And so that's a typical way they detect if a cancer is spreading. They biopsy nearby lymph nodes. Okay, so anyway, the lymphatic system is one of the major battlegrounds where white blood cells are fighting pathogens, and of course the other one is your blood, is your cardiovascular system. Now, so remember what we just said. These lymph nodes are these structures in the lymphatic system, about the size of a little kidney bean, where there are a lot of white blood cells stationed to fight pathogens that are in the lymph. There are some structures in your body that are much larger than lymph nodes, some organs in your body that are much larger than lymph nodes, but essentially act like big lymph nodes. So these are called lymphatic organs, and I just said they're organs that are part of your lymphatic system, but these are larger organs in your body, much larger than lymph nodes, but they essentially do the same thing as lymph nodes. They filter fluids, and they have white blood cells inside them to destroy any pathogens. So here's an example of some of these lymphatic organs, your tonsils. You find these at the back part of your oral cavity in the beginning of your pharynx. Your pharynx is right there at the back of your oral cavity. And so these tonsils, they're like big lymph nodes. They filter and cleanse the fluids inside your upper respiratory system, like your pharynx and your trachea. They filter and clean the fluids in there to destroy any pathogens. Yeah, so inside your tonsils, you have a lot of white blood cells stationed to kill off pathogens that are in your respiratory system. Another one of these lymphatic organs is called the spleen, and it filters and cleanses the blood. You can see the spleen right here. There it is. Yeah, so the blood filters through your spleen, and so there are white blood cells stationed at the spleen to destroy any pathogens in the blood. Now, another function of the spleen is removing old red blood cells. Red blood cells have a pretty short lifespan. They only last around 3 or 4 months. Now, why do they have such a short lifespan? Well, they don't have a nucleus, you might remember, and cells don't survive well without a nucleus. So red blood cells are constantly wearing out, like every 3 or 4 months, and they need to be removed from the blood. And so that also is one of the jobs of the spleen. And there's one more of these lymphatic organs I want to mention, the thymus. Here it is right here. The thymus is counted as a lymphatic organ, but it's kind of different from the other ones that I've mentioned. The thymus is not really about filtering any fluids. The thymus is kind of a training camp for some of your white blood cells. There's a type of white blood cell called a T cell, and it's a subcategory of one of those lymphocyte white blood cells. In other words, a T cell is a type of lymphocyte. And your thymus houses a bunch of these T cell lymphocytes, and it sort of essentially trains them on how to fight pathogens for you. That's why they call them T cells, because you find large amounts of them inside your thymus. All right, well, so moving on now to new material on the immune system. Click here, here, here. Here we go. The immune system is subdivided into 2 main parts. One is called the innate immune system, and the other part is called the adaptive immune system. So they're both parts of your immune system. These are just the 2 sides, the 2 faces of your immune system, so to speak. The innate immune system is sometimes called the non-specific immune system, and the adaptive one is the one that's sometimes called the specific immune system. And let me try to introduce first why they call them the non-specific and the specific immune systems. And let me introduce this concept by way of an analogy. Let's say for some reason you thought some bad guys were out to get you. And so let's say because you thought these bad people were out to get you, you put some bars on your windows and set up an alarm system in your house. So those defenses, your window bars and your alarm system, those keep all bad guys out, right? They're not really specific to any one particular bad guy. They thwart all bad guys trying to get inside your house and harm you. And so that would be non-specific, right? It says all bad guys are deterred by those. But let's say that somehow you knew that there was two bad guys in particular, Joe and Fred, who were trying to get you. And so let's say you hired a couple security guys and you said, hey, security guy number one, here's a picture of Fred. And so you defend me from Fred. And you go to security guard number two and say, here's a picture of Joe. Just defend me from Joe. So that would be very specific, right? The first security guard, his entire function is defend you just from Fred. And the second security guard, his job is to defend you just from Joe. So those would be sort of specific defenses. You have these guys who are protecting you from specific people. And so that's the way it works. The cells and organs of the innate immune system are non-specific. They defend you from all pathogens. None of the cells of the innate immune system are specialists in fighting off one particular pathogen. They are just general defenses against pathogens. Whereas it's the opposite for the adaptive immune system. The cells of the adaptive immune system are specialists. Each cell of the adaptive immune system specializes in fighting off one particular pathogen, one particular type of pathogen for you. Okay, so what we're going to do is go through the non-specific one, the innate immune system, and talk a little bit about what its cells and organs are, and then we'll talk about the adaptive immune system, the specific one. Okay, so body's two defense system, the innate non-specific one, and the adaptive, the specific immune system. Okay, the innate immune system is the non-specific one, the defense system that makes the body less accessible and less hospitable to all pathogens. So its parts, in other words, its cells and organs, do not specialize in fighting specific pathogen types. Instead, they defend against all pathogen types. So they are your general defenses against all pathogen types. Now, what I think is the very best example of an organ of your innate immune system is your skin. And at first you might think, well, my skin is part of my immune system. Well, it is. It's a general defense against pathogens. And here's why. So remember that the environment around us is full of pathogens, the air, every surface that you touch. And if not for your skin, those pathogens would get inside you every minute of every day. And there's so many pathogens that your immune system would just get overwhelmed and you would die. So every day your skin saves your life just by blocking pathogens in the environment from infecting you, from getting inside you. So notice that the cells of the skin are not programmed to fight any one particular specific type of pathogen. They block all pathogens. So that's why they're a good example of your innate immune system. All right. Oh, yeah. So this is just to underscore how important your skin is for saving your life, from stopping pathogens to get inside you. This is a picture from World War I, and I read somewhere that more soldiers died of infections from tears in their skin during World War I than actually died directly from getting shot or getting hit by bombs and things like that. A lot of World War I was fought in these muddy fields where there's a lot of cow manure and things, and so any cut in the skin allowed pathogens in the environment to get inside these poor soldiers, and so most of them died of infection because their skin was torn, not from actual bullet wounds or something like that. Now, these days, they've developed antibiotics, and so if a person does get a big tear in their skin and it gets infected from pathogens in the environment, they can give the person antibiotics, which oftentimes can control the infection. But World War I was fought before they invented antibiotics, and so a tear in the skin could very easily become infected and kill a person at that point. Okay, so another part of your innate immune system are those white blood cells that do phagocytosis. Remember, those are the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and, the monocytes that then turn into the macrophages. And the general term for any cell that does phagocytosis is a phagocyte. So, so the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and those macrophages that come from the monocytes, those are non-specific. They just patrol around inside your body and they eat any pathogen type. So they're part of your non-specific innate immune system. All right, here's another aspect of your innate immune system, what's sometimes called inflammation, or sometimes the inflammatory response. And so here's what this is about. If you've injured a body part, particularly an injury that involves where your skin gets cut, like I don't know what happened to this person, maybe they fell off their skateboard or something, I don't know. But if you injure a body part, especially if it involves with the skin getting cut, that area gets inflamed. And what we mean by that is the area gets red, it gets swollen, and it gets painful. And all of those are actually helping you. And so we call those three things together the inflammation, and those are helping you. Those are defending you against the pathogens. And so let me explain exactly how all of these are helping you when you have an injury. So let's imagine that we can have a close-up view of the skin that's been cut. Here's the skin, and this red mark right here shows where it's been cut. Well, like I said, there are pathogens everywhere in the environment, and so anytime your skin is cut, some pathogens are going to get inside there. And I'm going to use these little green shapes right there to represent some pathogens that have infected the cut in the skin. Well, the cells, your own cells in the area of the cut, can sense that the skin has been torn. The cells realize that they themselves have been damaged. And so when your cells sense that they themselves have been damaged, the cells start secreting distress molecules, which I'm showing in these as these kind of blue flashing molecules there. So the injured cells release these distress molecules. And these distress molecules do several things. One thing they do is they attract white blood cells to that area, which makes all the sense in the world, right? Because you want white blood cells in that area to fight those pathogens that have infected the cut in your skin. Those distress molecules also activate your pain receptors. And at first you might say, well, that doesn't seem like a good thing. Pain is not a good thing. Well, pain is good in the sense that it discourages you from using that body part. If you've injured your hand or your knee or whatever the body part is, it will heal faster if you're not using it. And so pain is actually good for you in that sense, and that makes you not use the body part and give that body part time to heal. All right, but let's go back to talking about how these molecules attract white blood cells. When I click the button, we're going to see a kind of a different version of the same scene. The cut in the skin and some nearby blood vessels. Here we go. So here's the cut in the skin right here, this kind of red area. And here are some pathogens that have infected the cut. And this is a nearby blood vessel. This is a capillary. So there's blood in here. And these cells are the cells that make up the wall of the capillary. Okay, so those distress molecules that the skin cells are releasing when you've cut yourself, those distress molecules, actually, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. These are some white blood cells that have been attracted to the area, because remember, those distress molecules attract white blood cells. Anyway, so those white blood cells right there want to get out of the capillary and eat those pathogen cells right there, because that's what at least some of those phagocyte white blood cells do. They eat pathogens. But notice that they're trapped inside the capillary. So the question is, well, how do they get out of the capillary so they could go out, outside your bloodstream and eat the pathogens like they're supposed to? Well, here you see the poor white blood cells, the phagocyte white blood cells not being able to get out of the capillary. Must be frustrating for them, right? Okay, so how do they get out? Well, there's a type of white blood cell called a basophil, And the basophil's white job cell is, the basophil's job is to secrete a molecule called histamine that's going to allow those white blood cells to escape out of the capillary and go eat the pathogens. And so let me back up a page here in your lecture outlines. Here in your lecture outlines, here's the list of the 5 white blood cell types. And so again, the neutrophils, eosinophils, and the macrophages that come from the monocytes, those are the phagocytes. They're the ones that eat the pathogens. But notice for this basophil white blood cell type, I said its function is to release histamine, to secrete histamine. Okay, so there's the basophil right there. And those little pulsing dots inside of it are supposed to be this molecule called histamine. All right, so when you cut yourself, the basophils also get attracted to this area of the cut, like you see there. And then the basophils secrete that histamine, release that histamine. And the histamine does a couple of things. For one thing, the histamine makes those capillaries larger. We say that the histamine is dilating the capillaries. Dilating is where a blood vessel gets bigger. And that's a good thing that the histamine molecule made the capillary bigger, because that brings more nutrients to the area. Those nutrients are going to be important so that your tissues, your torn tissues, can repair themselves. And incidentally, that's the redness of the inflammation. It's because the capillaries in that area have gotten larger, so there's more blood moving to that injured region. Okay, yes, so just to recap, the basophil white blood cell is not a phagocyte. Its job is not to eat the pathogens. Its job is to secrete these molecules called histamine molecules, and one of the functions of the histamine molecules is to dilate your capillaries, to bring more nutrients to the injured area. But those histamine molecules do something else too. Watch this. What those histamine molecules do is they make the walls of the capillaries slightly leaky. What they do is actually open up little spaces between the cells that make up the wall of the capillary. And that's good also, because that is what allows the phagocyte white blood cells to squeeze out of the capillary and go fight the pathogens where you've cut yourself. Now, it's not just the white blood cells that are going to be able to exit that leaky capillary. Some of the fluids in the blood also are able to leak out now that those little gaps have opened up in the wall of the capillary. But that's a good thing also, because that allows nutrients to exit the blood vessel, and so the torn cells can repair themselves. Anyway, so that's why the area around the injury gets swollen, because the capillaries are getting leaky, and white blood cells and fluids are then exiting the capillaries. So all this taken together, the redness in the area of the injury, from the blood vessels getting dilated, the swelling from the blood vessels getting leaky, and the increased pain in that area to discourage you from moving the injured part, all of those together are the inflammation or inflammatory response, and all of those are helping to protect you from the pathogens and to heal the wound. And again, this is a general defense. The cells that we're seeing involve the basophils and the phagocytes. They're not specifically against any particular pathogen. They are just general defenses against pathogens. Here's another part of your innate immune system, molecules called interferons. So this is a photograph of some of the cells in your body. And there's this one pathogen type called a virus. I guess I talked about this last week. Viruses are even smaller and simpler than bacteria. And viruses are so simple that they can't reproduce themselves. For a virus to be reproduced, it has to get inside your cells. And it essentially tricks your cells into making copies of itself. In other words, the virus reprograms your cells into making copies of the virus. Well, so your own cells are able to detect when they themselves get infected by a virus. And so when one of your own cells senses that a virus has gotten inside of it, generally that cell can't save itself. The virus is going to get reproduced inside that cell, and that will probably end up killing off, this cell. But nevertheless, a cell that's been infected by a virus will start secreting molecules called interferons. And these interferons allow neighboring cells to protect themselves from the virus, because this cell knows that very soon it's going to end up reproducing that virus, and so viruses will be secreted in this area. And so these interferons essentially warn the surrounding cells, like, hey, beef up your defenses against viruses, because I've been infected by a virus, and so you're going to be exposed to a virus also. And so those interferon molecules make cells strengthen their defenses against any virus, not any one particular strain of virus. And so those interferons are also considered part of the non-specific innate immune system. Here's yet another aspect of the innate immune system, fever. We've all gotten fevers when we're sick with various types of pathogens. And obviously it's no fun to have a fever. You feel sort of, uncomfortable, but it is benefiting you. The fever does help you battle the pathogens. And here's a little bit of the backstory of what causes fevers and how they help you. So let me see here. Here we go. So this is supposed to be a pathogen, and I'm showing it inside the person's head, but it could be a pathogen anywhere inside the body. And here's a white blood cell that's going to be fighting that pathogen, right? Looks like a phagocyte because it engulfed that white blood cell. Well, when phagocyte white blood cells are eating pathogens, the white blood cells simultaneously secrete molecules called pyrogens. And that's what those yellow flashing molecules there are supposed to be. Pyrogens basically give you the fever. So your hypothalamus part of your brain has lots of functions, but one of the functions of your hypothalamus is that it's your body's thermostat. So somewhere inside your home is your thermostat where you can dial the temperature you want your house to be. Well, that's one of the functions of your hypothalamus. It sets your body's temperature. And of course, most of the time, your hypothalamus sets you to normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees Celsius. And what is it Fahrenheit? 98.6, I think. But anyway, so most of the time, your hypothalamus sets you to normal body temperature. But when the hypothalamus receives those pyrogen molecules from the white blood cell, the hypothalamus will crank up the temperature to give you a fever. And how high does it go? Well, it depends how big an infection your white blood cells are fighting. But fevers can go 101, 102, or even 103 or 104 for short periods of time. So anyway, that's how the fever happens. The white blood cells that are fighting the pathogens secrete these pyrogen molecules, which go to the hypothalamus, and that causes the hypothalamus to crank up the body temperature to a fever temperature. And here's how that helps fight the pathogens. The pathogens, the bacterial pathogens, simply don't grow as well at that high temperature. So it's slowing down the growth of the bacteria that have infected the body. And the fever also speeds up your own body defenses. So it's sort of a twofold bonus in helping you fight off the pathogens. All right, and one more non-specific defense, something called complement proteins. And so here's a pathogen. I guess you can see some antigens on its surface here, but anyway, here's a pathogen cell. And there are some proteins in your blood called complement proteins. And the job of these complement proteins is to tear apart pathogen cells. The official name for tearing something open, the scientific term for tearing something open is called lysis or lysing. So we say that these complement proteins lyse pathogen cells. Here's a complement proteins. The complement proteins don't actually look like little missile darts. I just got a little imaginative when I made this cartoon. But anyway, complement proteins, they're blood proteins, and they lyse, they tear apart pathogen cells. And these complement proteins are non-specific. They can tear apart any type of pathogen cell, so that's why they're listed here as part of your non-specific immune system, your innate immune system.
Okay, that is the end of our discussion of the innate immune system, the non-specific immune system. And that's the end of part 1 of this lecture on the immune system. So now please start watching the part 2 of the immune system lecture, when we will begin to discuss the adaptive immune system, which is the specific part of the immune system.